The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the water park. Laughter echoed through the air, mingling with the splash of water and the distant hum of a lazy river. The park was nearly empty now, with only a few late-season stragglers still hanging around. For Mia and her twin brother, Josh, this was their last hurrah before college pulled them in different directions. "This place looks so different at dusk," Mia said, gazing at the towering water slides that now cast long, eerie shadows. "Kinda weird, right?" Josh chuckled. "Yeah, but that's why we came. One last thrill." They had been coming to this water park since they were kids, every summer. But this time felt different. Everything did. As the shadows deepened, the park seemed almost deserted. They could barely hear the lifeguards calling for people to leave, their voices distant and muffled, like something was swallowing the sound. They had one ride left, the plunge, a towering water slide that shot riders through a twisting tunnel of darkness before dumping them into a deep, isolated pool at the far end of the park. "I'm game if you are," Josh said, nudging Mia. "Last ride of the summer?" she asked, forcing a grin. "Last ride ever, maybe." They both laughed, but something in Mia's chest tightened. She shook it off and followed Josh up the winding metal stairs to the top of the slide. At the peak, the view was surreal. The water glistened darkly, reflecting the now orange sky. The park looked so empty. The lifeguard at the top barely acknowledged them, staring blankly as they settled into their positions. "You ready?" Josh asked, his grin faltering slightly. Mia nodded, her heart pounding. The lifeguard still hadn't said a word. The silence pressed down on her ... Without warning, the light turned green. Josh went first, disappearing into the tunnel with a shout. Mia took a deep breath and pushed off after him. As soon as she entered the tunnel, the world went black, the rushing water thundering in her ears. She felt the slide twist and turn, but something was wrong. It was taking too long. The ride was supposed to be quick, maybe 10-15 seconds, but it felt like she had been sliding for minutes. She tried to scream Josh's name, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The water beneath her felt thick, like sludge. She could feel it pulling at her legs, slowing her down. Then silence. The rushing water noise stopped, and she was in complete stillness. She wasn't moving anymore, and there was no light, no sound, just a claustrophobic grip of the tube around her. Her breath quickened as panic set in. Was she stuck? Where was Josh? She thrashed, trying to move, but her body felt heavy, like something was holding her down. Then, a faint sound echoed through the tunnel, a dripping, rhythmic and slow. Drip, drip. It was coming closer. Mia's pulse raced as the sound grew louder. The air felt colder, damp against her skin. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel something. A presence, something cold and wet brushing against her legs. She kicked, but the sensation only intensified. It was like someone or something was beneath her, pulling her down. "Josh!" she screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the echoing drip. Suddenly, the tunnel lit up with a blinding flash. She was hurled forward, violently spat out of the tube and into the deep pool. She surfaced, gasping for air, only to be met with silence. There were no lifeguards, no people, no Josh. The water around her was icy cold. She swam to the edge, but her arms felt weak, heavy. Something brushed against her leg again, and she whipped around. There was nothing there, but the water felt wrong. She looked closer, and her stomach dropped. The water was dark, not just from the fading light, but dark like it was tainted with something thick, something oily. "Josh," she whispered, panic rising. There was no answer. She pulled herself out of the pool, trembling, and called his name again. Silence. Her heart raced as she scanned the park. There was no one, just empty slides and the wind rustling through the palm trees. Then, from the far side of the pool, she saw him. Josh was standing in the water, his back to her. Relief flooded her for a split second. "Josh!" she called, running to the edge. But as she got closer, she froze. Something was wrong. He stood unnaturally still, his arms floating at his sides in the murky water. His head was tilted slightly downward, and his skin looked pale, almost blue in the dim light. "Josh?" Her voice cracked as she stepped closer. He didn't move. She hesitated, her breath shallow as dread crept into her chest. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers just inches from his shoulder. That's when she noticed the reflection in the water. There was something behind him. It was faint at first, like a shadow, but as she stared, it grew more defined. A figure standing directly behind him, long, wet hair draped over its face, its arms coiled around Josh like a lover's embrace. Mia stumbled back, her scream lodged in her throat. The figure's head turned slightly, just enough for her to see a sliver of its face. Its eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto hers. A smile curled across its lips, too wide, too unnatural. Without thinking, Mia turned and ran. Her feet pounded the concrete, slipping on the wet ground as she raced towards the exit. But the park was a maze, the slides towering above her, twisting into unnatural shapes. Every corner she turned led her back to the same spot, back to the pool. And every time she returned, Josh was still there, standing in the water, the figure clinging to him, closer, tighter. By the third loop, Mia could barely breathe. Her legs burned, her throat raw from screaming his name. Then she heard it, a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "You can't leave him." She whipped around. The lifeguard from earlier stood at the edge of the pool, his eyes dull, lifeless. "This is their place now," he said, his voice mechanical. "And soon, it'll be yours too." Mia backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the water lapping at her heels, rising around her ankles. The park was flooding, the water inching up, thick and black, consuming everything in its path. She turned to run, but the water surged forward, pulling her under. And then there was silence. The next morning, the park reopened like any other day. Families splashed in the pools. Children screamed with joy as they raced down the slides. And lifeguards kept watch, oblivious to the hidden horrors beneath the surface. No one noticed the faint chill in the air or the way the water in the plunge's pool shimmered just a little too darkly. Beneath the surface, unseen by anyone, two figures stood motionless, Mia and Josh, trapped in the murky depths. Their eyes wide, bodies eerily still, bound to the park in a ghostly realm that the living could never see, never understand. The water swallowed their presence, and they remained there, haunting the park's forgotten corners, forever lost in the drowning season. "Dude, there's no way you're gonna beat my time down this slide." Jordan laughed, standing on the towering platform of the Blackout, the tallest, fastest water slide at the park. His voice echoed across the park, mixing with the laughter of kids splashing below. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not break my neck," Megan shot back, playfully shoving him. "I mean, I plan on surviving summer. Thank you very much." Jordan grinned, his cocky swagger in full effect. "Surviving? Meg, this slide is nothing. I've been trained for this moment my whole life. When I hit the water, it's gonna be a cannonball that echoes through history." Megan rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, The only thing that's going to echo is your scream when you fly off the side. The two of them had been best friends for years, bonded over their love for water parks and stupid jokes that made no sense to anyone but them. This was their last summer together before they went off to different colleges. They'd promised to make it memorable, to laugh so hard their faces hurt. And for the most part, the day had been perfect. But as the sun started to dip lower, the park seemed to grow quieter. The crowds thinned out, and the usual hustle and bustle turned into a calm that felt almost too peaceful. A strange chill crept into the air, and the once crystal clear water in the pools looked darker, murkier. "All right, enough stalling," Jordan said, taking a deep breath. "I'm going down first, and when I win, you owe me that churro we saw earlier." Megan laughed, her smile fading as a strange feeling tugged at her gut. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "Fine, but if I win, you have to tell your mom you're not moving out. You're gonna stay home forever." He shot her a mock glare. "Low blow. See you at the bottom, sucker." Jordan stepped into the chute, his smile faltering just for a moment as the tunnel yawned open in front of him. It was pitch black inside, hence the name, the Blackout, and the idea was to scare the hell out of you by plunging you into total darkness before you hit the pool. He hesitated, but before Megan could make a snarky comment, he gave her a thumbs up and disappeared into the slide. "Chicken," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at her insides. She peered down the slide, but Jordan had vanished into the black void. She didn't hear him scream. She didn't hear anything. Her heart started to pound. Seconds ticked by. Too many seconds. Jordan should have been at the bottom by now, flailing around, yelling about how he crushed the ride. But there was nothing. Just eerie silence. "Jordan?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Still nothing. A knot formed in her stomach, and her pulse quickened. She leaned over, squinting into the tunnel, but the darkness was suffocating, as if it was swallowing all light, all sound. It made her dizzy just looking at it. Then, out of nowhere, a loud clang echoed through the tunnel, followed by what sounded like scraping metal. Megan stumbled back, her skin prickling with goosebumps. "Jordan!" she shouted, louder this time. Her heart hammered in her chest. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Before she could call out again, a lifeguard appeared at the top of the slide, looking bored and barely paying attention. "Hey, you going next or what?" Yeah. I was just waiting for my friend," Megan stammered. "He went down like a minute ago, but I don't think he's come out yet." The lifeguard raised an eyebrow, chewing his gum. "Nah, they all come out. Probably just taking his time in the pool." But Megan knew better. Something was very wrong. She felt it in her bones, that gut-wrenching feeling of dread creeping up her spine. Her mouth went dry. "I'm not going down there," she blurted, backing away from the chute. The lifeguard sighed, rolling his eyes. "Fine, I'll check the bottom for you, okay?" He sounded annoyed, but Megan didn't care. She watched him lazily climb down the stairs, her body frozen with fear. Minutes passed, and the longer she waited, the more the world around her seemed to shift. The sky turned a sickly shade of purple, the sun nearly swallowed by ominous clouds. The air felt thicker, like it was harder to breathe. Then, she heard it. A sound so faint at first, she thought she was imagining it. A whisper. "Megan!" Her blood ran cold. The voice sounded like Jordan, but it was wrong, distant, hollow. She whipped around, staring into the black slide tunnel. The whisper grew louder, echoing inside her mind, wrapping around her like a vice. "Megan!" Her legs felt weak, like they were about to give out beneath her. Her breath hitched in her throat as panic began to set in. "Jordan?" she whispered, stepping closer to the tunnel's mouth. The whisper turned into a low, sinister laugh. And then, something emerged from the darkness. Not Jordan. A hand wet, twisted, the skin peeling off in chunks, reached out from the tunnel. It clawed at the edge of the slide, pulling itself forward, the fingernails long and jagged, scraping against the plastic with a hideous screech. Megan's scream stuck in her throat as her eyes widened in terror. Her feet felt glued to the ground as the figure slowly crawled out. Its face hidden in the shadows, its body grotesque and dripping with foul black water. It moved with an unnatural, jerking motion, as if it wasn't used to being in its own skin. Megan. It rasped again, its voice garbled, like it was speaking through water. She snapped out of her frozen state and bolted down the stairs, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her breaths came out in ragged gasps as her shoes slapped against the wet pavement. She needed to find help, anyone. But the park was empty, silent. As she reached the bottom, she skidded to a halt, her stomach twisting in knots. The lifeguard from earlier was standing at the edge of the pool. Only, it wasn't him. Not anymore. His face was slack, eyes completely white, milky, and lifeless. His jaw hung open unnaturally, and black water poured from his mouth, pooling around his feet. Behind him, in the pool, was Jordan. His body floated face down, completely still, the water around him swirling with the same oily black substance. "No," Megan whimpered, her hands trembling uncontrollably. No, the lifeguard, or whatever was left of him, turned to face her, his head tilting too far to the side, bones cracking in the process. His mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "You're next," he gurgled, as the black water began to rise from the pool, creeping toward her feet. Megan stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. Her thoughts were a blur, terror clouding her mind. She had to run. She had to get out. But where? The exit seemed so far, and the water, thick and black like tar, was rising faster than she could comprehend. And then she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the pools, slides, and fountains, their bodies warped and waterlogged, their faces unrecognizable, skin sloughing off like wet paper. They staggered toward her, their mouths open, leaking the same inky liquid. Megan's heart pounded in her chest, her lungs burning as she sprinted toward the exit, her body screaming for oxygen. But no matter how fast she ran, the sound of sloshing water and the dragging of feet was always right behind her, closer and closer. And as she reached the gates, a cold, wet hand grabbed her ankle, yanking her into the darkness. Megan's heart pounded as she reached the gates, her legs burning with exhaustion. The water was rising, thick and black, swallowing everything in its path. She looked back just once, her breath catching in her throat. Behind her, the figures, those waterlogged, twisted things, staggered forward, their lifeless eyes locked on her, jaws slack and dripping with the oily liquid that had once been the pool water. Her hand fumbled with the gate, the metal cold and slick under her shaking fingers. Almost there, she thought desperately. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The gate was locked. No. She whimpered, her pulse thundering in her ears. She tugged harder, throwing her whole body weight against the bars. They clanged and rattled, but stayed firmly shut. Behind her, the sound of sloshing water grew louder, closer. Panic clawed at her throat. She turned around, gasping as the black tide crept up the steps, licking at her feet. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her ear, sending a shiver straight down her spine. It was Jordan's voice, only it wasn't right. It was warped, distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Megan, help me." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Jordan?" Her voice wavered, a sliver of hope slipping through the overwhelming fear. "Where are you?" "Megan, I'm here." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her, pulling her into its depths. She whipped her head around, looking for any sign of him. But all she saw was the creeping black water, now nearly at her knees, bubbling like something alive. Suddenly, something broke the surface. A hand. Jordan's hand. His fingers grasped the edge of the steps, trembling as if he was struggling to pull himself out of the water. Megan's breath caught in her throat. "Jordan!" She dropped to her knees, reaching out to him. "Hold on, I'm coming." But as she reached for him, his face broke through the surface, and her stomach twisted in horror. It wasn't Jordan. His eyes, once vibrant and full of life, were now empty, white like polished stones. His mouth hung open, slack and dripping with black water. His skin was gray, sagging, like it had been underwater for far too long. He wasn't alive. Megan stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hand that had reached for her was decaying, the skin peeling back to reveal bone beneath. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Jordan, or whatever was left of him, rose from the water, his body jerking unnaturally, twisted by whatever had taken him. His dead eyes locked onto hers, and a horrible smile stretched across his face, wide and wrong. "Megan," he rasped, his voice hollow, bubbling with the black water that still poured from his mouth. "Come with me." She backed up against the gate, her knees shaking so badly she could barely stand. "You're not Jordan," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're not him." Jordan's smile widened as more figures began to rise behind him. Dozens of them, bloated and decaying, their eyes lifeless, their mouths hanging open. The water sloshed up against the steps, creeping closer, pulling her in. The smell of rotting flesh and stagnant water filled her nose, making her gag. She turned and clawed at the gate again, her fingers raw from the cold metal, but it was no use. The lock wouldn't budge. "Megan, it's better down here. Join us." Jordan's voice echoed, sending chills through her bones. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head violently. "No, no." Suddenly, the air felt thicker, colder, like something was wrapping around her throat. She gasped for breath, clawing at her neck, but there was nothing there, nothing she could see. But the pressure grew stronger, pulling her closer to the rising black tide. Her legs gave out, and she fell to the ground, the water lapping at her ankles now. As she tried to push herself up, she felt something cold wrap around her wrist. Jordan's hand. His grip was icy, bone-crushing, pulling her toward him. "No, get off me," she screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip only tightened. She stared into his milky eyes, her stomach twisting in knots as his expression remained eerily blank, his mouth still locked in that grotesque smile. The other figures were coming closer now, their dead eyes focused on her, moving in unison like puppets being pulled on strings. The water was up to her waist now, thick and heavy, making it impossible to move. Her heart raced as terror surged through her veins. And then, she heard it, a low whisper that made her blood run cold. "You can't escape us." It wasn't just Jordan speaking. It was all of them. Their voices blended together into a horrifying chorus, echoing inside her head, filling her with a dread so deep she felt like she was drowning. Megan's vision blurred as the cold water reached her chest, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her breaths came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one harder than the last. She looked up at Jordan, his empty eyes boring into hers. "Don't fight it," he whispered. "We're already dead." Her vision went dark as the water rose higher, pulling her under. Her lungs burned, her body thrashing as she tried to break free, but there was no escape. The last thing she saw was Jordan's face hovering above her, that twisted, cruel smile forever etched into her mind. The water closed over her head, cold and suffocating, dragging her down into the black depths. Days later, the water park was back to its usual buzz of activity. No one noticed the missing lifeguard or the two teenagers who had disappeared without a trace. The park's water flowed as usual, clear and pristine, with only a slight ripple here and there, almost like something was moving just beneath the surface, something no one could see. And as the laughter of children echoed through the park, if you listened closely, you could hear it, the faintest whisper carried on the breeze. Megan. But no one was ever there to hear it.